May 11, 1960, Buenos Aires, Argentina. Israeli agents surround a man walking home from a bus stop. Within seconds, he's forced into a car and disappears into the night. The man has been living under a false name for over a decade. His real name is Adolf Eichmann. And the question that would haunt historians for generations wasn't just how he survived the war, it was who helped him escape. This is the story of the network that spirited one of history's most wanted men out of Europe. A network that operated in plain sight. A network that some say could never have functioned without help from the very institutions meant to uphold justice. To understand Eichmann's escape, we first need to understand who he was. Not the monster of propaganda, but the bureaucrat who made genocide possible. Adolf Eichmann joined the SS in 1932. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a frontline killer. He was an administrator, a logistics expert. And that made him infinitely more dangerous. By 1941, Eichmann had become the Nazi Reich specialist in what they called the Jewish question. He organized the deportation trains. He coordinated timetables. He ensured that millions of people reached the death camps with German efficiency. Witnesses would later recall his obsession with schedules, his pride in moving hundreds of thousands of people across Europe like cargo. He didn't pull triggers, he signed papers. And those papers sentenced more people to death than most soldiers ever could. By the spring of 1945, Eichmann knew what was coming. The Reich was collapsing. The Americans were closing in from the west, the Soviets from the east. For men like him, there would be no mercy. The question was simple: how do you disappear when the entire world is looking for you? The final weeks of the Third Reich were chaos incarnate. Cities burned. Refugees flooded the roads. Military units dissolved. And in that chaos, thousands of Nazi officials simply vanished. Eichmann wasn't alone. Across Germany and Austria, high-ranking Nazis were shedding their uniforms, burning their documents, and adopting new identities. Some committed suicide. Others surrendered, believing they could talk their way out of prosecution. But many, like Eichmann, chose a third option. They ran. In late April 1945, Eichmann abandoned his post in Prague. He obtained false papers identifying him as a Luftwaffe corporal named Adolf Karl Barth, not a high-ranking officer, just another faceless soldier in a defeated army. He grew a mustache, he kept his head down, and he walked right past the Allied checkpoints. For weeks he moved through the American occupation zone. He slept in barns. He avoided cities. And somehow, despite being on the wanted lists, despite the thousands of soldiers searching for Nazi war criminals, he disappeared into the masses of displaced persons flooding Central Europe. But Eichmann didn't disappear on his own. He had help. And that help came from a network that had been preparing for this moment long before the war ended. They called them the Rat Lines. Secret routes stretching from Germany through Austria and Italy, ending in ports where ships departed for South America. These weren't spontaneous escape routes. They were organized, funded, and protected by people who believed that certain Nazis deserved a second chance. The most famous rat line ran through the mountains of Austria into Italy. From there, fugitives could reach Genoa or Rome, and from those port cities, board ships bound for Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, or Chile. But walking that route required documents, identification papers, travel visas, money. And that's where the network proved its worth. Eichmann spent nearly 4 years hiding in northern Germany, working under false names as a lumberjack and farmhand. He kept moving, never staying anywhere long enough to be recognized. But by 1948, he'd made contact with the network. And that's when his escape truly began. How did a wanted war criminal obtain the papers to flee Europe? The answer lies not just in criminal organizations, but in institutions the world still trusted. The story of Eichmann's helpers begins with former SS officers who'd embedded themselves in refugee organizations. These men knew who needed help escaping. They knew who had money, and they knew how to exploit the chaos of post-war Europe. One name appears repeatedly in the historical record: a network of former SS and Wehrmacht officers who operated safe houses across Austria. These men provided shelter, food, and most importantly, connections. They moved fugitives from one location to another, always one step ahead of Allied investigators. But the former Nazis couldn't have operated alone. They needed legitimacy. They needed institutions that could issue documents without arousing suspicion, and they found willing partners in unexpected places. Certain members of the Catholic clergy became crucial facilitators, not the entire church, not official policy, but individual priests and bishops who believed that even war criminals deserved Christian charity, or who harbored their own sympathies for fascism, or who simply saw these fugitives as anti-communist allies in the emerging Cold War. One bishop in particular ran what historians now call a rat line within the rat line. His office in Rome issued thousands of identity documents to displaced persons. Many were genuine refugees. But mixed among them were men like Eichmann, men who arrived with false names and left with the papers to start new lives. The International Committee of the Red Cross, too, became an unwitting accomplice. Their travel documents were meant to help stateless refugees. But the organization's procedures were lax: a testimony from a priest, a false name, a sympathetic official. That's all it took to obtain papers that opened borders. Did the Red Cross know they were helping war criminals? Some officials later claimed ignorance. Others admitted they'd suspected, but looked the other way. In the desperate years after the war, the line between refugee and fugitive blurred. And in that blurred space, Eichmann found his path to freedom. But perhaps the most disturbing question isn't who helped Eichmann escape. It's who chose not to stop him. Intelligence agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain knew about the rat lines. The Americans knew, the British knew, even the Soviets knew. And yet, the escape routes remained open for years. Why? The answer is as cynical as it is practical. The Cold War had begun. Former Nazis possessed intelligence that Western powers wanted. They had knowledge of Soviet operations. They had networks in Eastern Europe. They could be useful. Not every escaped Nazi was recruited, but enough were considered valuable that the intelligence services developed a calculated indifference to war criminals who weren't considered high-priority targets. Eichmann fell into a strange category. His name was known, yes, but he wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a spy. He was a bureaucrat. And in the brutal calculus of post-war intelligence priorities, bureaucrats ranked lower than more immediately useful assets. There's evidence that American counterintelligence corps officers encountered Eichmann's name in interrogations as early as 1947. They knew he was alive. They had leads on his location. But those leads were never seriously pursued. Resources were directed elsewhere. Files were misfiled. And Eichmann kept moving. The question that haunts historians is whether this was incompetence or complicity. Did agencies fail to catch him, or did they choose not to? We may never know the full truth, but we know this. When Eichmann finally obtained his escape papers in 1950, he did so while intelligence agencies on 3 continents had his name in their files. In early 1950, Eichmann was living in a small town in northern Germany under the name Otto Henninger. He'd survived 4 years of hiding. But he knew he couldn't stay in Europe forever. The net was tightening. Former colleagues were being discovered. Trials were beginning. It was time to leave. Through his network contacts, Eichmann reached out to the organization that would facilitate his escape. He traveled south to Austria, then into Italy. In Genoa, a Franciscan priest provided him with a new identity. His new name was Riccardo Clement. Profession, technician. Nationality, stateless. According to his Red Cross travel document, Riccardo Clement was a refugee seeking a new life. The document bore official seals. It looked legitimate because technically it was. With that single piece of paper, Eichmann walked into the Genoa Port Authority and booked passage on a ship bound for Buenos Aires. No one questioned him. No one checked his background. He was just another refugee among thousands fleeing post-war Europe. The sophistication of these documents is worth noting. They weren't crude forgeries. They were real papers issued by real organizations. The deception wasn't in the documents themselves, but in the identities they represented. Eichmann had become Ricardo Clement in every official capacity. He had a past that could be verified, references that would vouch for him. A history entirely invented that could withstand casual scrutiny. How many others obtained papers the same way? Historians estimate that hundreds, possibly thousands, of Nazi war criminals used similar documents to flee Europe. Some were caught years later. Others died in peaceful obscurity, their crimes unknown to their neighbors. On July 14, 1950, Ricardo Clement boarded the ship Giovanni. The vessel departed Genoa, bound for South America. Eichmann stood on the deck as the Italian coast receded behind him. After 5 years of hiding, he was finally escaping Europe. But why Argentina? Of all the places he could have fled, why did Buenos Aires become the destination for so many Nazi fugitives? Argentina in 1950 was governed by Juan Perón, a leader with fascist sympathies and a pragmatic approach to immigration. His government welcomed European refugees, particularly those with technical skills or capital. And his administration asked few questions about the pasts of incoming settlers. Perón's Argentina offered more than just lax immigration policies. It offered cultural familiarity. Large German-speaking communities existed in Buenos Aires and the provinces. A fugitive could blend in, speak his native language, find employment, live without constant fear of recognition. The country also lacked an extradition treaty with many allied nations. Even if someone were identified, removing them from Argentina would be diplomatically complex. For a war criminal, this made Argentina a near-perfect sanctuary. When Eichmann arrived in Buenos Aires in mid-1950, he entered a community that already sheltered dozens of former Nazis. Some lived openly under their real names. Others maintained their false identities. They met in certain cafes, they attended the same social clubs, they helped each other find work and housing. Eichmann initially worked odd jobs. He labored on a farm. He worked in a laundry. These were humiliating positions for a man who once controlled the fate of millions. But they kept him invisible. And invisibility was survival. By 1952, he'd saved enough money to bring his family from Germany. His wife and children arrived, believing Ricardo Clement was their husband and father's true name. They settled in a modest house in the suburbs of Buenos Aires. To their neighbors, they were just another German immigrant family. For 8 years, this was Eichmann's life. Quiet, anonymous, safe. But what's remarkable isn't that he stayed hidden. It's that so many people knew where he was and said nothing. Eichmann's whereabouts weren't a complete mystery. Former SS colleagues knew. Members of the German expat community whispered. Letters reached Europe containing hints about his location. And yet, for nearly a decade, no serious effort was made to find him. Part of this was practical. In the 1950s, war crimes prosecution had lost momentum. The world was focused on rebuilding. The Cold War dominated headlines. The Holocaust, while acknowledged, hadn't yet become the central moral touchstone it is today. The names of perpetrators were known, but the political will to pursue them had waned. But silence also came from those who'd helped him escape, the priests who'd issued his documents, the officials who'd looked the other way, the intelligence officers who'd misfiled his records. All had reasons to keep quiet. Admitting what they knew meant admitting what they'd done. And then there were those who simply didn't care. For many in Argentina's German community, Eichmann was just another refugee trying to start over. His past wasn't their concern. This willful ignorance created a protective bubble around him. People who suspected who he really was chose not to ask questions. Even Eichmann's own family remained in partial darkness. His wife knew his real identity, but his children grew up believing they were the Clements. Neighbors saw him as a quiet, somewhat austere man who kept to himself. No one looked at Ricardo Klement and saw the architect of genocide. But thousands of miles away, someone was looking. Someone who'd lost their entire family in the Holocaust. Someone who would spend years searching for the man responsible. Simon Wiesenthal, the Nazi hunter who'd survived 5 concentration camps, never stopped searching for Eichmann. Neither did Fritz Bauer, a German prosecutor who believed justice required more than just moving forward. And neither did the Israeli intelligence services, who saw capturing Eichmann as a national imperative. The breakthrough came in 1957. A half-blind German immigrant in Buenos Aires began dating Eichmann's son. The young man bragged about his father's past. The woman mentioned this to her father, who had connections to the Jewish community. And slowly, carefully, information began to flow. Israeli intelligence agent Zvi Aharoni traveled to Buenos Aires in early 1960 to confirm the target. He watched the house. He followed Ricardo Klement to work. He noted the man's mannerisms, his walk, his profile. And he became certain this was Adolf Eichmann. The decision to capture rather than assassinate Eichmann was deliberate. Israel wanted a trial. They wanted the world to hear what had happened. They wanted testimony, evidence, accountability. On that evening in May 1960, the operation took less than 2 minutes. Eichmann was grabbed, sedated, taken to a safe house, and there, after being asked his name, he reportedly said, "I am Adolf Eichmann. I know I'm in the hands of Israelis." He seemed almost relieved. Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem, which began in April 1961, became one of the most important legal proceedings of the 20th century. For the first time, Holocaust survivors testified in detail about what they'd endured. The world watched, and the man in the glass booth, the man who'd organized the logistics of genocide, offered a defense that would echo through history. "I was just following orders," he said. He claimed he was a small cog in a vast machine, that he'd had no choice, that he bore no personal responsibility. The trial exposed the lie. Witness after witness described Eichmann's enthusiasm, his initiative, his pride in his work. This wasn't a reluctant bureaucrat. This was a man who'd volunteered for his role and executed it with ruthless efficiency. On December 15, 1961, Eichmann was convicted of crimes against humanity, crimes against the Jewish people, and war crimes. On June 1, 1962, he was hanged. His body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered at sea, beyond Israel's territorial waters. Even in death, he was given no ground to occupy. But the trial did more than deliver justice to one man. It forced the world to confront questions that had been quietly ignored for 15 years. How do we measure complicity? The priests who issued documents claimed they were offering Christian mercy. The Red Cross officials said they were following procedure. The intelligence officers insisted they were prioritizing Cold War objectives. Everyone had reasons, explanations, but reasons aren't the same as justification. Eichmann didn't escape Europe alone. He escaped because people made choices. Some actively helped him, some passively allowed it, some simply looked away. And each of those choices, however small, however rationalized, helped ensure that a man responsible for coordinating the murder of millions lived comfortably for a decade while his victims were still being mourned. The story of Eichmann's escape isn't just about one man. It's about systems that fail, institutions that compromise, and individuals who, when faced with moral decisions, choose convenience over justice. We tell ourselves these are exceptional circumstances, that ordinary people couldn't have known, that the chaos of post-war Europe made such escapes inevitable. But the truth is simpler and more uncomfortable. They knew, or they could have known if they'd wanted to. Eichmann's name was in the files. His crimes were documented. The networks helping him operate weren't invisible. They were known to authorities who chose, for reasons of politics or expedience or indifference, not to act. Today, when we ask, how did Eichmann escape, we're really asking something deeper. We're asking how societies allow such things to happen, how institutions meant to uphold justice become complicit in its evasion, how good people convince themselves that looking away isn't a choice. The answer lies not in secret conspiracies or elaborate plots, but in ordinary human decisions. A priest who believes in redemption signs a paper. An official who wants to avoid complications processes a document. An intelligence officer who has bigger priorities moves on to the next case. Each action, small on its own, becomes part of a chain that allows monsters to escape. And that's what makes this story so unsettling. It wasn't the work of villains helping villains. It was the work of ordinary people making ordinary compromises. People who probably considered themselves moral, who went to church, who loved their families, who would never have considered themselves accomplices to genocide. But they were. The network that helped Eichmann escape Europe didn't disappear after his capture. Some of the same priests continued their work with refugees. The same officials processed documents. The same intelligence agencies pursued their Cold War objectives. Life went on. Systems persisted. And other Nazis, learning from Eichmann's capture, became more careful. Some changed their identities again. Others moved deeper into obscurity. A few surrendered, realizing the net was tightening. But many lived out their lives in peace, dying decades after their victims, their graves marked with false names. We caught one. But how many remained free? That question haunts Holocaust historians and survivors alike. The Eichmann trial brought attention to Nazi war criminals. Yes, it sparked new investigations, renewed commitments to justice. But it also revealed how much had been lost in the years of indifference. Witnesses had died. Evidence had degraded. Trails had gone cold. Justice delayed is justice diminished. And for the thousands of perpetrators who escaped prosecution, delay meant freedom. When Eichmann stood in that glass booth in Jerusalem, he faced not just the court, but history itself. He was asked to account not only for his actions, but for the philosophy that justified them, the belief that orders absolve responsibility, that bureaucracy dilutes guilt, that distance from the act of killing makes one innocent of murder. The court rejected every argument, and in doing so, it established something crucial. There is no hiding behind procedure, no refuge in hierarchy, no escape in claiming you were merely a cog. When you make murder efficient, you become responsible for that efficiency. When you coordinate genocide, you are a perpetrator of genocide. The title you hold doesn't matter. The uniform you wear doesn't matter. The orders you received don't absolve you. What matters is the choice you made when you could have said no. Eichmann had that choice, and he chose to organize death with German precision. But this isn't just a story about one Nazi war criminal. It's a story about how societies protect, knowingly or not, the people they should be punishing. How institutions preserve themselves even when preservation means compromising their values. How silence becomes a form of complicity that's harder to prosecute, but no less damaging. The people who helped Eichmann escape were never tried. Most were never even identified. They returned to their lives, their roles in his escape becoming footnotes in history. Some probably felt guilt. Others likely rationalized their actions until they believed their own justifications. But their choices had consequences. A decade of freedom for Eichmann meant a decade of stolen justice for his victims. It meant survivors who died before seeing him captured. It meant children who grew up never knowing if their parents' killer had faced accountability. Every day he remained free was a wound left open. There's a reason this story still matters. A reason we keep returning to it, keep asking how it happened, keep searching for the names of those who helped. Because the structures that enabled Eichmann's escape haven't disappeared. the tendency of institutions to prioritize their own interests over justice, the willingness of individuals to make small compromises that enable great evils. The capacity of societies to look away when seeing would be inconvenient. These patterns persist, not in identical forms, but in recognizable shapes. And understanding how they worked in 1950 helps us recognize them today. Eichmann's escape wasn't inevitable. It was the result of choices, hundreds of individual choices made by people who had alternatives. Who could have said no? Who could have looked deeper? Who could have cared enough to act? They didn't. And that's the lesson that echoes across decades. There's a small memorial in Buenos Aires, not far from the house where Eichmann lived. It marks not his presence, but his victims' absence. The 6 million who never got the chance to flee to Argentina, who never received false papers, who never boarded ships to safety. Visitors stand there, reading the names when names are known, thinking of those who have no names. And they ask the same question historians have asked for decades. How did this happen? How did a man responsible for coordinating the murder of millions live freely for 10 years, shopping for groceries in a quiet suburb while the world moved on? The answer is no longer a mystery. We know the routes he took, the people who helped him, the documents he carried. We know the names of priests and officials and agents. We know the institutions that failed or looked away. We know everything except why knowing hasn't been enough to prevent it from happening again in different forms, with different names, in different places where justice still waits while those who should answer for their crimes walk free. The machinery that helped Eichmann escape was dismantled, but the human tendency that built it remains, the willingness to look away, the readiness to prioritize convenience over conscience, the quiet cooperation with systems that do harm because questioning them would be difficult. Those tendencies don't belong to history. They belong to us. And recognizing them, understanding how they operated in 1950, might be the only memorial that matters, the only way to ensure that the next time evil seeks escape, the ordinary people who could stop it choose differently. They choose to see, to act, to refuse complicity, even when complicity is easier. Because in the end, Eichmann didn't escape because he was clever. He escaped because enough people decided not to stop him. And that decision, replicated across institutions and individuals, granted him a decade of life he didn't deserve while his victims remained in graves they shouldn't occupy. That's not a mystery. That's a choice. And choices can always be made differently. If we remember, if we care, if we refuse to look away. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more untold stories from history. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.